overall theme for this conference is about policymaking in an uncertain world. And I think when you look across not just Ireland but other high-income countries, one of the root causes for uncertainty in people's personal lives, well, an obvious one is the nature of employment. You know, where are they going to get work? How long is that work going to be for? Will they have to change their work frequently? How are they going to fund for their life after retirement if they even get to retire? I mean, that's one source of uncertainty. Another source of uncertainty is, well, where are they going to live? And what we've seen over the last 30 to 50 years, depending on the country, is a one-off increase in the cost of existing housing that, due to artificially induced scarcity, and that has meant that there's a generation that have done very well out of this once-off increase, but the generations before, they had other challenges, but the generations coming sort of on stream now looking for housing, it's very uncertain how they're going to live and where they're going to live and how much that's going to cost. So I took the opportunity of that theme to look a little bit more at the root cause of that uncertainty is not actually one of the topics that I talk about a lot is construction costs, and that's not really that's the issue right now in Ireland, but it's not the issue in many countries why housing is so expensive. When we think about sort of superstar cities like London or New York or San Francisco, that's not the issue there. The issue is around land use. So this is the sort of medium to long term picture, but obviously the context matters. This is the blue line at the top there is the average number of new households formed between the 2011 and 2016 censuses in the Greater Dublin area. It's about 650 a month, every month. And the bars below are the total number of homes completed by local authority in the 8 local authorities of the Greater Dublin area. And the obvious thing is that in not a single month of those 5 years did we see enough new homes added to match the new households being created. And when you stack that all up, particularly with the big gaps at the start, you have more than twice as many new households formed in those 5 years than dwellings added. There's 2 issues with the dwellings added bit. The first is that's completions, not commencements, so it's not fully accurate data. It includes houses that were built during the bubble, but were never connected to the electricity grid, which is how you measure completions. Well, it's how Ireland measure completions anyway. So the true number it may be a third less than that. So instead of 18,000 completions, there may only have been 12,000 completions. It gets worse because housing goes obsolete. And even if you have a 0.5% going obsolete, you end up going from maybe 12,000 net or gross additions to perhaps maybe 6,000 or 8,000 net additions to the housing stock in the Greater Dublin area at a time when you had at least 40,000 households added. And then the last thing to make it even worse again is that household formation is what an economist would call endogenous. People don't just form households regardless of the housing market. They take account of the availability and the affordability of housing when thinking about when to leave home and when to settle down, buy a house and so on. So we're talking about a ratio of at least 5 and probably 7 or 8 and maybe even 10 to 1 of new households being formed relative to new dwellings being added. So that's the context, and clearly there are issues there in the short and hopefully short term, and hopefully they don't become deeply entrenched around construction costs, but also around the subsidising of households who can't afford, even with lower construction costs, to meet the cost of accommodation. But really, if we're going to solve this properly, if we're going to get housing affordable, there's no technological barrier, it's a policy barrier. And to go right back to basics, this is how, for non-economists in the room, this is how economists see the world in all its glory. Those 3 or 4 letters, that living standards depend on your stock of capital and your people. And in sort of that very simple view of the world, a lot of, say, Irish economic policy makes sense. You've got a stock of people. How do you boost their living standard? Well, you attract more foreign direct investment. You bring more capital in and you boost living standards for labour. And this is the basic solo model of economic growth. This is what drove a lot of economic policy, not just in Ireland, but in many parts of the world. They didn't have enough capital, bring capital in, and that's how you achieve your higher living standard. But starting probably around 30 years ago, people realized that may not be a fully accurate view of the world. I know economists are going to balk at that, but actually there might be more important detail in there. And one of the big changes was changing from the idea of these, identical labor units that you get a human and they can do any old job, just get more capital and they'll be better off, to actually everyone is different. Maybe non-economists realized this hundreds of years ago, but economists only copped on to this 20 or 30 years ago, that all people are different. And if you have heterogeneous, economists can't say different, you have to have, your own language. So if all human capital is heterogeneous, then active labour market policy makes sense. The idea that you as an unemployed person don't have a sole responsibility to find work, that there's a joint responsibility between you and the state or the local government to help you find work, that there's a social return and a private return. It's not all on you, but it's not all on the state either. You don't just get money for nothing, that active labour market policy is where there's a sort of an individual case officer, and you go to them and you say, here's what I've been doing to try and find work, and they say, well, actually, given your CV, have you thought about retraining in these skills, because there's a lot of vacancies in this area. And that active labour market policy is now, Ireland is one of the last countries to really go down this route. Most other countries, the bulk of the money they give out in what would be termed unemployment assistance is active rather than passive. It's not just unconditional money, it's conditional in some way. Now, so far so good, but I'm going to argue that that's also not an accurate description of the economy, that there's another letter we need in there. We're going to go all the way to adding another letter, and that letter is N, or for the it's land or natural resources or place, and place matters. And actually, a lot of, again, if you look back over the course of most of economic history, place matters a huge amount. That no two places are exactly the same. Distance between place matters. And in fact, if you look at, say, was something like, Sean will correct me, is it maybe 7 million hectares in the Republic of Ireland? Dublin City, the full, not the city council, the full city is about 0.5% of that. And a lot of Dublin City is green space, suburban. The bit that's actually valuable, the bit that's irreplaceable, is maybe only 0.1% of the landmass. And then you add in the valuable bits in the other major cities, you're talking about something like 0.1 or maybe 0.15% of all the land in Ireland is valuable to the extent that we should really care about how we use that land. A lot of land is relatively substitutable. It might be used for low intensity purposes, for residential or agricultural or green space or forestry, or not used. There may be a lot of, John mentioned that earlier, a lot of sort of very low density uses that are quite low value. But when you think about the very high value stuff, it really matters that those sites aren't used. There's an opportunity cost. In the same way that all individuals are unique, all sites are unique. And there are some high value sites that we need to make sure are used well. So, and there's the papers will be going online after this after the symposium finishes, and in the paper that accompanies this presentation, I go through the four main areas of active labour market policies and sort of try and convert them into what I'm calling active land use policies. So I change the word slightly from labour market to land use, because it's about market and non-market uses of land, and factoring in all of that variety. So these are the four main areas of active labour market policies: employment, subsidies, retraining and matching. Employment is where the government's solution to there being unemployed people is just to say, right, well, we'll hire you to do any old thing. So William Petty back in the 1600s had the idea of, if you've got unemployed people, sturdy beggars with nothing to do, you just hire them to move Stonehenge from one field to the next and then move it back. And at least they're doing something for the money that you give them. That example probably summarises the problem as well. That's not very useful. If you've got something useful that needs to get done, well, then employ them. If you're just employing them for the sake of employing them, that's going to be a waste of money. And that's, the literature has largely found that. And similarly, if you're going to subsidize private sector employment as a solution to unemployment, you need to have very clear rationale for what's the market failure here. Why is it the case that these people are not being hired directly if they're good enough to do the job? If they're not good enough to do the job, then you retrain them. If there's lots of vacancies in area A and lots of unemployed labour in area B, well, that's slightly different. You can't just subsidise that out of existence. You need to retrain that out of existence. Or it could be the case that it's about matching, that you've got some sort of information failures where it's obvious to employers what they're looking for, and it's obvious to unemployed people the skills they have, but actually there's a match, and for some reason there's that match is not getting spotted by those two sets of parties. And roughly speaking, to crudely summarise the research on active labour market policies, the first two areas are reviewed as having a very poor rate of return for the taxpayer. That matching is strongly favoured for a short run return, that you get a big short run hit out of a small investment in trying to help people search and match up with jobs. And the more expensive but longer term return comes on retraining, either training people up or retraining them from one sector into another. And I want to take those four areas and think about this as land use. Can we take the same idea and see which of the areas are going to make sense and what sort of policy implications they have? The first one is that the public sector would decide that there's land that's not being used and it will just use it itself for any old purpose. If there's a valuable site in the North Docks there beside the IFSC, why is nobody using it? Why don't we park some buses there? Well, you can see there's probably a problem there. That land is rarely never used. The problem is it's underused. The issue with land is underemployment, not unemployment. That example of the buses, I'd say over the last 2 years, I've probably, between 30 and 50 times, I've presented a map of Dublin bus depots and Dublin bus routes. And I was trying to estimate, what's the average number of people at those presentations? I'd probably talk to, 1,000 or 10,000 or something people and ask them the question, why does Dublin Bus have its depots where it does? And no one's ever got the answer right. And the answer is because that's where they always were. The Dublin United Tramway Company itself was an amalgam of two earlier tramway companies which bought depots on the edge of the city. They made rational decisions in the 1860s and 1870s, and now we're left with incredibly valuable central sites because technology has changed, not least by tramways, that these sites are now in the middle of the city and very valuable and being wasted. So I don't think the answer to unemployed land or underemployed land is just get the public sector to use it any old way. In fact, that's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Directly subsidising land use, again, I'd be worried about, what's the market failure here? Why are you foregoing, say, tax revenue on a particular site just to get it used? And we all know that there's lots of issues around, well, I'll tell you what, you don't pay any tax if you use that site. You end up getting sites that shouldn't be used for particular purposes, used for those purposes. Yeah. So I'd argue that those two areas, just like with labour market policies, that direct public sector employment of land and direct subsidies for private sector uses of land are not the way to go. We need to think more like retraining the land. So one of the key policy mindset shifts I'd love to see is that every site, every major tract of land is reviewed. Maybe every 5 years, maybe more frequently, maybe less frequently. This is the Dublin Industrial Estate. The Cross City Lewis is going to finish here. This is about 170 acres. If you go through it, it's mostly retail and some light industrial and a few Baptist churches, because Baptist churches don't pay rates. So we have a major investment finishing in a half-used industrial estate. And I've argued with Dublin City Council about this a number of times. And they say, well, it'd be just too difficult to change the use. That's not good enough. Why are we putting a multi-billion euro investment somewhere where, it's not going to get used, but it's too difficult to change? And their argument is, well, we couldn't possibly assemble this as a site and set it off. Well, don't. Put in a land tax and get the private sector to do all the tough work of assembly. Don't take it on yourself if you can't do it. So change one, I think, has to be around reviewing use. And the default not being the last use, the default being the best future use. That you look at land and say, if these are the 10 main types of land use, what are the potential, which are the highest value uses of this site? And can we somehow shift use over into that high value use over maybe the next 10, 15 years? And the last area then is around matching. I pass this site every day. This is a site that's for sale. Knight Frank have been trying to sell it for 3 years. I would argue that there's a joint responsibility on the part of the site owner and the local authority for sites like this. If you look at this site, it's not particularly big, but it's definitely suitable for apartments. It's between Smithfield and Stoneybatter. The problem is, if you were to build apartments on this now, it would not be viable. You need to put in enough basement car parking spaces. You'd have to have your apartments facing south and west. Well, there's an apartment block and a prison, so you'd need to face them north and east. You're not allowed to do that. So the other element, so the joint responsibility element. So one is that we need to review and be continually changing the use in response, continually not every month, continually every decade, changing the use of sites. The second area is around matching, that there's now a joint responsibility on the part of the site owner and the part of the local government to figure out, why is this site not being used? And if you had a case officer who looks at this site, they'll find out pretty quickly that a number of the most important reasons this site is not being used is down to Dublin City Council regulations themselves. And this is my last slide. With joint responsibility, I think the easiest way of getting the site owner, you could argue, okay, well, on this site, maybe the site owner is looking for 10 million and it's really only worth 1 million. Right? It's the site owner's fault. Well, figure out what the site is worth and charge them a land tax. So that internalizes the responsibility to use that site for socially optimal uses on the part of the site owner. But that's only half the battle, because the local authority has a responsibility as well. And I think a lot of this could be solved by changing one word in many local authority development plans. The idea of a minimum, if you have that as a target, and then in particular sites, you will not be able to have 100% south facing. Let's just be honest. You will not be able to have 100% two-bed, or whatever the ratio. They prescribe ratios about the number of one-beds to two-beds, the depth of balconies, the height of ceilings, the number of lifts per floor, the number of basement car parking spaces to number of apartments, what percentage of the apartment should be storage space. All of this is specified as minimums. You cannot go below this. Well, for any number of those reasons, that site is probably made unviable. I think there's a huge opportunity there to get sites used much better than they are, but it involves active land use policies rather than just passive ones. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Ronan.